Everyone. May I request all of you to kindly have a seat, and I will request my colleagues to close the door there so that we will have a bit less of a disturbance. This is a very eminent panel on the stage, and this panel we will have in the format of a talk show, which is we will raise some questions, some issues, and try to have a perspective from across the eminent panel here. And the first issue which I will like to put in front of the panel is that what is the role of the private sector in education, which is right now needed in the context of wherever India is. And as my minister, honorable minister talked about in the morning, that the amount of investment needed, the government cannot afford that, and maybe private sector has to pitch in. But is the ecosystem, is the environment right for private sector to step in? And what are the challenges private sector is facing in investing in education, and what are the opportunities? So that is a broad arena with which we will start, and every speaker will have 5 minutes to speak about it. And there are also people, we have the chancellor from the VIT here, so he can talk about the from the other side of the table, that how he sees the collaboration with the private sector. So we'll start from Murli itself. Yeah, you can speak from there. Actually, it will be a 5 minutes for each of you, and then we can raise to the next question. Yeah, Murli. Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. I think over the last couple of years, we've seen a huge set of debates, discussions on the massive expansion in the education sector and the need for further expansion. And there's been a lot of discussion, debate about participation of the private sector. And we also see a lot of participation in the form of both universities at the college level and of formal education service providers coming into the segment, into the sector. I think I run a company which is actually a complementary service provider. It's an assessment company. We've spent the last 11 years of our lives building the part of the assessment industry. I think so my perspective is really about not so much about the formal education service providers, but more about what is the role and need for the complementary service providers and how they can add value. And I believe that as the industry grows and as there is a huge need to grow, I think there'll be a big role for players like Meritrack and many other service providers to come in and add value to the whole chain of education and enable the larger formal education providers to grow. So we do assessments, we enable organizations to attract more people, to attract quality people. We help them improve their learning outcomes. And I think that's a significant value add because as the growth in numbers on education happens, there's the other side of the coin of quality. And quality is best defined and managed by a set of measurements of both input and output of especially of learning outcomes. And that's where I think there's a huge need for the private sector, because the private sector can bring into play a combination of technology, a combination of an entrepreneurial spirit, and a combination of identifying the right need. One quick example I'll leave and then maybe I'll end this thing. For a long time, biometric authentication has been available. Okay, people have been using biometric as a technology for attendance systems, for a whole lot of tracking. For the first time last year, we used that existing technology. We identified a problem saying that impersonation is a large issue in any examination process in India, and we combined this problem and the available technology, and created a mobile biometric authentication service which can be used in the regular pen and paper exam itself. Okay, and that has enabled a lot of large prestigious institutions to completely eliminate impersonation in an extremely secure and this thing. So this is an example of a very existing technology. Everybody knows about biometric. It's been available, used for various modes, but applied through the identification of the need and a process by a private sector company and to provide significant value add. So a lot of very prestigious examinations now are using that, and that's one role. And I see this continuing, the whole thing of technology innovation, which the private sector can bring in and enable the larger organizations to do what they're doing and to do it at scale. So that is where I think the role would be.
Thanks, Murli. I think that was very helpful. Our next speaker is Sushma Barlia, who is leading the APJ Satyagraha, and she has led the whole group into the higher education, the school education, and the vocational education. And with that kind of leadership, how you are seeing the expansion and the, I will say specifically the bottlenecks, why the private sector investment of is not happening more. Yeah.
Hello.
Sorry.
First of all, I think if you look at the education space, I just like to very quickly say that the 4 pillars of education that we've been talking about, learning to know, learning to learn, learning to do, and learning to live together. And if you combine that with the issues of access, quality, equity, and relevance. I'm not speaking anything new because these are the imperatives which have been there in front of us for a very long time. And the interesting thing is that when we discuss with global counterparts across the world, it appears that even in the nations like Canada, US, UK, where you would have expected that many of these issues had been resolved, they are still very much up in the air, particularly when you talk about inclusive growth and quality education. If you look at the scenario in India, I think the starting point is access. And if you are talking about access, I'm not going to throw statistics over here because I think all of us here are well aware of the supply-demand disconnect in terms of higher education. What I would like to highlight, however, is that first of all, when we are talking about higher education, on one side we need to see this strange situation where as industry, and I am also involved with many industries including pharmaceuticals and construction and finance, we are finding that there is a scarcity of manpower almost at every level and every skill that you can think of, and right from the low end to the top end. On the other hand, you are talking about employability on the other side, and you are talking about whole number of unemployed graduates, apart from unemployment or underemployment of people who don't necessarily have the right access to education. If you are talking about higher education, I would like to look at it both in terms of traditional higher education, skill development, and institutions specialized in training and retraining. And I think the real problem here is that if we look the investment and resources that are needed in expansion, government has made it very clear that they are not able to do it by themselves. The kind of increase in gross enrollment ratio that is needed is not just going to come from their investment. If we look at private initiatives, whether it is universities and colleges that have been set up in recent times, all the new additions also barely cover up to 1 million students, so to speak, who would be able to get access to education. So if we really want to gear this up to a very high-end level of education, then we have to think beyond the traditional means, and we have to see how do we encourage private sector to come in. Now, when you are looking at private sector to come in, they are, of course, private education providers who are coming in and would come in regardless in terms of contribution to society. This is how APJ has been there for the last 40+ years. But how many people do we actually expect to come into the space of education purely for not-for-profit motivation? And if we really look at it, many of the people even today who are under the garb of not-for-profit are actually looking at surplus of profit maximization. But can you really blame the private sector? At the end of the day, they are taking risks, they are providing investment, they are coming in a very large way, and if they need to do that, then they need to think of it in terms of returns. So I think if we have to improve scalability, we have to look at two areas. One, how do we provide a regulated way of ensuring that those who come in for a for-profit motive, we have an open system for them to come into a for-profit environment through companies shortlisted on stock exchange, maybe a body like TRAE and other such regulatory bodies to see what they are doing, backed up by good accreditation agencies, with accreditation being compulsory. And on the other side, we also encourage the not-for-profit. From point of view of not-for-profit, if you look at us, we are both encouraged and discouraged. We are encouraged because I am really delighted to find that if I look into the various provisions of UGC, of all the other acts that currently prevail, there is actually a lot of flexibility which I think many of us are not making the most of, in terms of different modes of provision of education, in terms of the kind of structure and flexibility that we can provide through our educational system. But at the same time, we need to recognize that knowledge doesn't have any barriers or boundaries, and all the artificial barriers that we have set up between vocational education, higher education need to move away. But most important from my point of view is what I would call the inspector regulatory Raj, which unfortunately is still currently in place, the license Raj, if you will. Yes, there has been a lot of reform movement, if you will, which has been happening in the space, so to speak. Good intentions, lot of energy being put in. The great thing is that people are now talking about higher education and how important it is. But if we really need and want this to happen, then we need to create the right kind of autonomy, the right kind of a transparency in the environment, which will encourage those who are there in the not-for-profit space also to at least come out there and be able to contribute their 2 bits, if you will. So I think
it was quite helpful. Our next speaker is Amit Gupta, who is leading the S-Chance group. And they have been a very eminent group in the education space for decades now. And from your long experience, sir, like how has the education scene changed over the years, and what is the challenge and opportunity? Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to share a few experiences. One is based on the company I represent, and one is based on, I would say, my own personal experience being an engineer 30 years back and how things have moved. I would put it like this, that as a company, when we claim that we have empowered 3 generations of independent India, we say that for last 70 years we have been leaders